There is a thinking error that keeps many people trapped, small, even when they have the potential for much more. And the problem is that this error feels logical. It feels sensible. It even feels responsible. But in practice, it limits everything. This error is simple. Believing that you must first have, in order to become. Have more money to then start something. Have more time to then commit. Have more knowledge to then act. And so life goes on hold. There is always a condition to be met before starting. There is always a later. Later when things improve. Later when there's more time. Later when you're ready. But that later rarely comes. Andrew Carnegie understood this very clearly. He knew that growth does not begin with what you have. It begins with what you decide to become. Because those who wait to have first postpone indefinitely. And those who decide to become start with what they have. This is the point that separates stagnation from progress. Most people condition action on circumstance. But those who grow condition circumstance on action. They start before they feel ready. Before they are certain. Before they have guarantees. Because they understand something few accept. Clarity does not come before action. It comes during. This thinking error creates a dangerous illusion. The illusion of preparation. The feeling that something is still missing. That it's not the right time yet. That it's not enough yet. And while this happens, time passes. Ideas never leave paper. Projects never begin. Changes never happen. And everything stays the same. Because waiting to feel ready is one of the most effective ways to never start. The truth is that readiness is built in the process. No one starts prepared. No one starts confident. No one starts fully capable. But those who start build all of that along the way. Andrew Carnegie built his trajectory understanding that action creates capability, not the other way around. He did not wait to have all the answers. He started and developed as he moved forward. And that changes everything. Because it shifts the focus from when I have to I start now. Another factor that keeps this error active is fear disguised as logic. Now is not the right time. I need to prepare more. I need more security. All of this sounds rational. But often, it is just resistance. Resistance to discomfort. Resistance to risk. Resistance to the unknown. And while this resistance leads, nothing changes. Because growth requires the exact opposite. Exposure, attempt, error, adjustment, and repetition. But that is not comfortable. And because of that, the mind tries to protect by keeping everything as it is. The problem is that this protection is expensive. It costs time. It costs opportunity. It costs potential. And most of all, it costs life. Because where there is waiting, there is no building. Another effect of this error is comparison. Looking at those who are already ahead and concluding that you are not at their level yet, and using that as a reason not to start. But this ignores a basic truth. Everyone who is ahead also started without being ready. They also started with doubt. They also started with little. The difference is not in the starting condition. It is in the decision to begin anyway. Andrew Carnegie believed that thinking is the starting point of any result. And this thinking error creates an invisible block, a block that does not appear as an external limitation, but as internal delay. And delay is one of the quietest forms of failure, because it does not cause immediate pain, but it accumulates loss over time. That is why correcting this error does not require more information. It requires a shift in logic. Replacing when I have, I'll do with I do to become. Replacing waiting with movement. Replacing perfection with progress. This does not mean acting without direction. It means acting with what exists today and improving along the way. Because it is through movement that capability grows. It is through practice that confidence appears. It is through repetition that mastery is built. And this creates a cumulative effect. Small actions, repeated, with consistency, create large changes over time. But everything begins with a simple decision. Stop waiting and start, even without guarantees. even without certainty, even without being ready, because being ready was never the requirement. It was always a well-constructed excuse. And the moment this becomes clear, something shifts. Responsibility appears, because there is no longer the illusion that something external is missing. It becomes clear that what was missing was decision. And decision changes direction. Direction changes results. Results change life. In the end, it is not about conditions. It is about posture. It is not about having more. It is about becoming more. And that begins before any achievement. It begins in the mind. Because the error that keeps you small was never outside. It was always in the way you think. And the good news is, thinking can be adjusted. And when thinking changes, everything else starts to change with it. And when this thinking error begins to be corrected, something that once seemed distant starts to appear. Real movement. Not that superficial movement, full of intention and little execution, but concrete movement. Visible. Progressive. Because when logic changes, action changes. And when action changes, patterns change. And it is the pattern that defines the result. There is, however, an important detail in this process. At the beginning, almost nothing feels rewarding. The first attempts are imperfect. The first results are small, and often invisible. This creates a trap. The feeling that it's not working, that maybe it's not worth it, that the effort is not being recognized. But this is not a problem with the process. It is a problem with expectation. Because real growth is not immediate. It is accumulated. Small actions, small adjustments, small advances, repeated over time. And this accumulation, at some point, becomes visible. But before that, it is silent. And it is in this silence that most people quit. Because they don't see return. They don't see validation. They don't see concrete proof. But it is exactly at this point that everything is being built. Andrew Carnegie understood that results don't appear at the beginning because there isn't enough volume of action yet. He knew that what separates those who grow from those who stop is not talent. It is continuity. The ability to keep going even when there is no visible result yet. And that requires maturity. Maturity to not confuse lack of results with lack of progress. Because progress is happening, even if it is not visible yet. Another factor that appears at this stage is doubt. Doubt about the path. Doubt about capability. Doubt about the decision made. And this is natural. Because leaving the old pattern creates instability. The brain still tries to return to what is familiar. But it is exactly at this point that the decision must be reaffirmed. Not based on emotion, but on clarity. Clarity that staying the same has a greater cost than changing. And that cost is often not immediately visible. But it exists, and it accumulates. Lost time, missed opportunities, untapped potential. And this does not impact a single day, but it impacts years. That is why staying in the same place is not neutral. It is a choice with consequences. And recognizing this strengthens change. Another important point is understanding that this new pattern demands responsibility. Because there is no longer the excuse of lack. There is no longer the justification of circumstances. There is only decision. And decision requires positioning. It is no longer about trying. It is about owning. Owning that results depend on what is done, not on what is expected. This completely changes posture, because it removes focus from expectation and places it on execution. An execution, repeated, builds identity, an identity based on action, not on intention. And this creates something powerful. Confidence. Not confidence based on motivation, but confidence based on evidence. Evidence that it is possible. Evidence that it is working. Evidence that the process is advancing. And this confidence grows over time. Not because everything becomes easy, but because capacity increases. Challenges continue to exist, but the response to them changes. And that is evolution. Another factor that sustains this growth is constant adjustment. There is no perfect path. There is adaptation. Test, observe, correct, and continue. This cycle of continuous improvement prevents stagnation and keeps progress active. Andrew Carnegie applied this in his decisions. He did not seek perfection. He sought efficiency, and efficiency comes from adjustment, not from waiting. Another essential factor is clarity of priority. Without priority, everything feels important. And when everything is important, nothing is executed with quality. That is why choosing what to focus on is part of growth. And choosing means letting go. Letting go of distractions, of excess, of activities that do not contribute. This is not loss. It is direction. And direction accelerates results. Another relevant point is emotional consistency throughout the process. Not every day will have energy. Not every day will have motivation. Not every day will be good. And that cannot define continuity. Because if action depends on emotional state, the pattern never stabilizes. That is why acting regardless of mood is a differentiator. Doing what needs to be done, even without desire, even without enthusiasm. This creates stability, and stability creates predictability, and predictability creates results. Andrew Carnegie did not depend on moments of motivation. He operated with discipline, and discipline reduces variability, transforms action into pattern, and pattern into results. Another important point is understanding that growth requires time of exposure. Time enough to fail, time enough to learn, time enough to adjust. Without this time, there is no real development. There is interrupted effort. An interrupted effort reinforces the old cycle. That is why sustaining the process is more important than starting with intensity. Intensity without continuity does not build. Continuity, even with low intensity, builds. And builds solidly, without shortcuts, without illusions. Another relevant aspect is the relationship with recognition. At the beginning, almost no one notices the change. Almost no one values it. Almost no one follows it. And this can be discouraging. But depending on external recognition keeps the thinking error alive, because it brings action back to validation. And this must be broken. Focus must be on the process, on internal progress, on consistent construction, not on approval. Because approval is variable, but process is controllable. And focusing on what can be controlled increases efficiency. Another decisive point is the ability to sustain difficult decisions. Decisions that do not bring immediate pleasure, but build long-term results. This requires vision. Vision of the future. Vision of consequences. Vision of direction. Without this, decisions are based on the present. And the present often favors comfort. But comfort does not build growth. It builds permanence. And staying in the same place is no longer a conscious option. Because now there is clarity. There is still a stage beyond this point that few reach. Because it does not require only action. It requires consistency for long enough that the new pattern becomes dominant. At the beginning, there is effort. There is active awareness. There is clear intention. But over time, this needs to evolve. It needs to stop being effort and become automatic. In the same way the old cycle was built. Repetition, time, consolidation. But now consciously. And this is a critical point. Because many people start, but few sustain it long enough for the change to stabilize. And without stability, the old pattern always returns. Not because it is better, but because it is stronger, older, more deeply rooted. That is why prolonged consistency is not just important. It is decisive. It is what determines whether change will be temporary or permanent. Another point that emerges at this stage is refinement. At first, the focus is on escaping the error. Then, the focus shifts to improving what works, adjusting details, increasing efficiency, reducing waste. And this elevates the level. Because growth is not just about moving forward. It is about evolving continuously. And that evolution requires attention. It requires analysis. It requires constant awareness of what is working and what can be improved. Andrew Carnegie understood that real progress is not linear. It is progressive, built in layers, a solid foundation, then optimization, then expansion. And each phase requires a different type of thinking. At first, courage, then discipline, then strategy. And this creates something even more powerful: skill. Because when the pattern is consolidated and refined, it can be expanded, applied to other areas, replicated, multiplied. And at this point, growth stops being individual effort and becomes a system that works regardless of motivation, regardless of circumstances, based on structure. And structure creates predictability, and predictability creates control. Another important aspect at this level is the ability to ignore noise. Because as growth happens, exposure also increases. Opinions appear, criticism, suggestions, comparisons, and all this can distract. If there is no clarity, that is why maintaining focus becomes even more important. Knowing what to ignore, knowing what does not matter, knowing what does not add value. Because growth is not just about doing more. It is about eliminating better. And elimination is a skill. Removing distractions, reducing excess, simplifying decisions. This increases efficiency, and efficiency accelerates results. Another critical point is avoiding a new mistake: overconfidence. Because as results start to appear, there is a tendency to relax, to lower standards, to subtly return to old patterns. And this can compromise everything. That is why maintaining a high standard is essential, not through pressure, but through identity consistency. Because now it is no longer about effort. It is about who you have become. And identity sustains behavior. If identity changes, patterns change. That is why protecting this identity is fundamental. Another important aspect is the ability to deal with new challenges. Because growth does not eliminate difficulty. It elevates its level. New problems appear. New decisions need to be made. And this requires continuous adaptation. But now there is a foundation. There is structure. There is experience. And this changes how challenges are handled. There is no longer impulsive reaction. There is strategic response. And this improves the quality of decisions. Andrew Carnegie operated at this level. He did not react to the environment. He directed it. And this is only possible when the internal pattern is solid. Another relevant factor is long-term vision. Without vision, decisions are based on the short term. And the short term favors comfort. But growth requires immediate sacrifice for future gain. And that is only sustained with clear vision. Vision of where you want to go. Vision of what is being built. Vision of the accumulated impact over time. Without this, the process loses meaning. And when it loses meaning, it loses continuity. Another essential point is expanded responsibility. Because as growth happens, decisions begin to impact more people, more results, more consequences. And this requires maturity. Maturity to decide with awareness, to sustain pressure, to maintain clarity even in complex scenarios. And this is not developed theoretically. It is developed in practice, through repetition, through experience. Another important aspect is the balance between action and reflection. Acting without reflection creates repeated mistakes. Reflecting without action creates stagnation. The balance between the two creates evolution. Directed action, strategic reflection, continuous adjustment, and this sustains growth over time. Another often overlooked point is that at this level, the greatest risk is not failure. It is stopping evolution. Because stagnation at higher levels costs more time, more opportunity, more impact. That is why maintaining continuous growth becomes a priority. There is always something to improve. There is always something to adjust. There is always something to develop, and this keeps the pattern active. Another essential factor is clarity of purpose. Without purpose, growth loses meaning. It becomes accumulation, and accumulation does not sustain long-term motivation. Purpose gives direction, gives meaning, gives strength to continue even in difficult scenarios. And this sustains consistency. Andrew Carnegie did not just build wealth. He built impact. And impact requires purpose. Another important point is complete autonomy. The ability to decide without depending on external factors. To maintain direction regardless of approval. To continue regardless of recognition. This closes the cycle of dependency and creates real freedom. Freedom to build. Freedom to choose. Freedom to direct. And this completely redefines the way life is lived. In the end, everything returns to the same principle. The thinking error that kept things small has been replaced by a growth logic. A logic based on action, on consistency, on responsibility, on continuous building. And this logic does not depend on luck. It does not depend on perfect conditions. It does not depend on the ideal moment. It depends only on sustained decision. And sustained decision creates pattern. And pattern creates results. And results create reality. From this point on, there is no going back. Because understanding has changed. Perception has changed. Identity has changed.